Hi everyone, welcome to the last Tinderbox Meetup for April. Can't believe it's already May. Time just is marching on. Welcome to the Tinderbox weekly meetup. We meet every other week, every other Saturday, every other Sunday. The typical format is we talk about tools for thought, knowledge management, and all of the various ways we're going about facilitating our thinking and the types of work we produce from our knowledge management efforts. We will go around the room and introduce new people if they are there. I don't see any new people today, which is fine. If we have a theme, we jump into that theme and talk about that theme, which we do not have today. And then we will ask and answer questions that we all collectively have around our individual projects or things we're just generally thinking about when it comes to the world of tools for thought and knowledge management. And so let's just jump right in. So who's got any agenda items that they want to talk about today? And so we get ourselves started. Anybody got anything? What are you guys working on? Don't all go race out at once and contribute. Frederick, what do you got? What do you got going on in your life right now when it comes to note taking in Tinderbox?
Yeah, I don't have much new at this point. I know that you and I talked, but I don't have much to share today, really.
Okay. Okay. All right. As always, I've got new toys and projects I can share when we're ready, but I want to go around the room first. Chuck, how about you? What's going on?
Well, I spent the week actually writing in Tinderbox, but it was content preparation rather than doing anything elaborate or new with Tinderbox. So,
All right. And how did that go for you writing in Tinderbox? What was that? What was your experience?
um, I mean, it works fine. It's I'm just using it, pretty much as the enhanced note taker.
Okay.
Jot down notes, collect my thoughts, and then just start writing, which is one of the more useful aspects of Tinderbox.
And when you go about doing that, like what's your workflow? Do you break things up into notes? Do you have every like one note be your entire article? How do you structure that?
Um, I don't think there's any consistent way I do things. It's somewhat a function of how I approach a project. So, in this particular case, I'm, writing up an article that will get published and, I can share it with people, but it's on, the issues, some of the security issues with Internet of Things devices. And I'm taking a different approach, and I've created a big bibliography of all the stuff that's out there, and kind of gotten a sense for where I think the gaps are, what nobody's talking about. And so it was those gaps that kind of started, and I began just taking some notes. In fact, didn't even really use the outlining feature of Tinderbox. I just popped up a note and just started jotting down thoughts and ideas and things that I knew I wanted to create.
Yeah.
And then once I had that done, I didn't even need to look at it again because now I just needed to start writing. And so I just popped open a note that would be for one topic of that I'm covering and just started writing in there, and then realized that means I needed to add some additional text to another note that was preceding that one. And that's how I go about doing it. It's a back and forth exercise, and I don't want friction. And
Right.
fortunately, Tinderbox doesn't throw up much friction until I want to export it.
Okay. That's an interesting thing. So I would you suggested Tinderbox doesn't offer add a lot of friction, but I would say that many people that are unfamiliar with it would say it adds a ton of friction because they don't understand attributes and they understand prototypes and they don't understand nesting in containers and that whole onboarding discussion we were having a couple of weeks ago. And then I appreciate your until I want to export it chuckle, in that seems to generate friction for some and many, and I certainly agree that that friction's there. But yet, once one overcomes that friction, it opens up an entire world. And in some respects too, that friction actually can be beneficial if you don't allow it to scare you. So maybe we can talk a little bit of that too.
Yeah, it's not that it's scary. It's just that I haven't invested the same amount of time you have on the export side. I have mostly been using Tinderbox as a personal tool and collecting and organizing and quote curating data. So I haven't. In this case, I'm going to put this out as a Substack article. I will probably just do copy and paste to get it there. That's adequate. It's not in my way. It's minor friction. And it's just an article.
No, but
now,
when you say copy and paste from where? So like from the text itself, or
yeah,
will you, or do you
just
have some
literally,
form of, sorry, just to finish the question, or do you have some form of template so that you are copying and pasting from preview? So what are you copying? How are you copying and pasting?
well, I'm going to initially, because I have not used Substack before. I mean, some of my partners are, and we do have a regular Substack that's associated with an RIL consulting group. And I'm probably just going to use the standard Substack template that they're using, and it's going to have a few sections in it. I'll set those sections up, and then I'll just copy the text from Tinderbox and pop it into that template, and that gets me there. I think that
No, again, I don't think you understood my question. Are you copying the text from Tinderbox by literally copying the text in the text window, or are you hitting preview and copying the entire article from preview?
No, I'm doing the former. I'm just copying it out of the text windows.
Got it.
Yeah, and again, I think, one of the things that we shouldn't overlook is the fact that Tinderbox can be a very useful note-taking tool that you can then turn into articles or documents or, entire books, I suppose. It's not in your way doing that. But when you come to needing output in a particular format, then you have to start paying attention to some of the more elaborate tools in exporting. And I appreciate that. And as I said, it's one of my next tasks to gain some degree of comfort with in Tinderbox is, just all the things that are in the export realm, which you are the master of. And but at the same time, I think some of the friction comes from the fact that when we start looking at export, it's where are we trying to go to? And there, I think, is one of the problems. Has nothing to do with Tinderbox, but that there are so many formats out there. Are you trying to go to a web page? Are you trying to go to a Word document? Heaven help us. Are you trying to go to, a journal publication? Those are all very different activities, very different outputs from the same content. And, I think that's one of the areas where if you're going to use Tinderbox effectively, you've got to get your hands around how all that works. And that's next on my list of things to learn in Tinderbox or acquire in Tinderbox.
Yeah, and then it's then also realizing that there's those interim steps where you can use Tinderbox to perform, calculations for you to be able to create, again, that point of either fully, and I can demonstrate this today too, if I think it'd be helpful for the direction where this conversation is going, where you can export the complete element of what you're showing in your writing, but with a little thought, you can also have Tinderbox do summarization for you, and then have that summarization be part of what you're producing, and I find that incredibly valuable too.
Yeah, no arguments. It's all stuff that I will be taking on. I mean, one of the things I'm already doing is building up my bibliography on in Zotero, and I have a reasonably good idea of how to bring that into Tinderbox and begin to correlate that information. The other thing I'm doing, very much like you, is I've got a lot of terminology to deal with. And I'm not so much worrying about it at this stage of what I'm doing, but I am capturing the terms because at some point I will want to be able to perform outputting of glossaries. So again, one of the things I like is I don't have to solve that problem yet, but I do know that I want to start collecting these pieces of information, and I would like to have a note per term, just as you
Yeah.
do.
Mhm.
Nothing magical about it, and Tinderbox is not in my way of starting that. It just comes to the point where you've invested huge amount of time and effort of, how do you then say, I want to automate it so I can take terms and put them into a glossary, or I can have terms referenced um, in my document, and that allows me to set up an index. I mean, those are all wonderful things. Um, and I would hate to try and, while other tools like Word have capabilities that deal with that, I am just so tired of I'm done with Word. I cannot
Yeah,
tolerate that piece of
I am too.
crap
I've
anymore.
fully divorced myself from it unless I absolutely have to because somebody else's weakest link in the workflow chain makes me do it.
Yeah.
So can we pause there real quick? And if you guys don't mind, I think this would be a nice segue for me to demonstrate to you, if I can find it. Where is it? The latest project I've been working on this week, because I think it segues perfectly into what you just brought up, but now I gotta find it. I've got too many windows on my screen. This is annoying. Where is it? Do you remember, how do you pull all your windows into one screen on
Um,
when there's
three
when it
finger,
doesn't?
if you're using a tablet, three finger shift up or
No, I'm
should do
not.
it.
I'm using
And I
full
can't,
screen tile.
I
Isn't
am
it
so wed to
on
my tablet.
isn't
I
it
just
on the
can't.
F3 key above it, the show all the windows button?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I just can't find. Okay, let me just quit and see if I can open it that way. It's just super annoying.
I can't play with it because things like that invariably seem to screw up Zoom on my system.
Yeah, yeah,
Zoom is something that once I get into it, I try to be careful because, boy, it is easily confused.
yeah, yeah.
And that
And
may have to
so,
do with the fact I've got an old machine. So who knows?
if we want to, we can jump into, because you just brought up this idea of glossaries and indexes, and honestly, that is the exact project I was working on this week. And I've nearly, actually, I have completed all the coding of it. Now I'm in the process of, probably tomorrow I'll work on building the installer for it, and that will become the next module for my publishing system. But to your point, that's where, again, as you've all seen my evolution over the last 4 years, that's where I've really, and as Steve and I were talking about just before we hit record on today's session, the ability for, and Steve, maybe you could reiterate, because we didn't capture it on the recording before I jump in. You were kind of pining, ideating on this fungible tool we've got called Tinderbox, and you can start creating and I'm kind of I'm rephrasing what I heard you say, but we've got this tool called Tinderbox, and we can start doing stuff, and then that allows the content that we're producing to kind of take its own path, and you can create terms. You can create, you can maybe you can just reiterate what you were saying, because I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I was using a lot of analogies because it's hard, the language is hard to pin down, but I was saying it's sort of amoeba-like, like doesn't have necessarily fixed borders. And every time you come to Tinderbox, it's kind of a different experience. So it's evergreen in that sense. And I was also making the point that often with software, you have to live within the world of the software designer. Um, and Mark Bernstein has created a world where, yes, he puts a few limits on it in the ways things are structured, but largely it's the world that you create, not the world of the software designer.
Yeah.
Did, did
Yeah, and you
want
you
more
were
to
saying a
that?
few other words along that way, though. It's like, as you're using Tinderbox, you can follow the path of your thinking, right? You can
Right.
add some, Tinderbox doesn't constrain you into, like, for me, that's why I can't stand Word, is it it forces me into this linear thinking process, and I'm kind of forced to shove stuff into this linear mode, whereas Tinderbox lets me go multi-dimensional, has this multi-dimensional path that I can follow and then put constraint on as I want to at some point.
Yeah, the quintessential sort of you got to do it the designer's way, I think, is PowerPoint.
Right.
The most structured kind of thing. Yeah, there's a little bit of customization, but pretty much they imagine that everybody does a presentation in exactly the same way, you know, a topic slide and then other slides underneath, and they all have a title and some content and that kind of thing. So,
yeah. And Frederick, to answer your question from the chat, yeah, I've played with Mello. Honestly, I've played with all of them. And yeah, again, going back to what Steve and Chuck were just talking about, you know, if your goal is to write a word processing document, Mello's a lot like Scrivener. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Another similar cousin to Mello would be Ulysses. I'm familiar with a lot of people that really, really love Ulysses and have written complete books on it. And absolutely nothing wrong with that software. But going back to the conversation that Chuck was having, and as I've demonstrated continuously through the work I've been doing over the last few years, once you kind of break those barriers and you do figure out action code and you do figure out templating, all of the other tools can become totally superfluous because you know, Tinderbox can do it all, and you're not limited by the boundaries of those other pieces of software. And that's what I'm trying to do in the developing of my publishing system modules. And that, you know, right now as it stands with the 5 modules I've released and the one that I'm just about to demonstrate to you just now, you can in fact write an entire book in Tinderbox, and you don't need any of those other utilities or tools.
My question though is, you know, you collaborate with other people and they all insist on Word, and I don't know, Chuck is copying and pasting probably into a Word template. I don't know. I mean, these publishers and everybody want Word, they don't want something else. And I'd like to ditch my Word license completely and just get rid of Word. I'm sick of it because you touch one thing and the whole document goes nuts, and I'm tired of it. And Mel at least doesn't do that. Apparently they have objects that actually make sense. So, but I'd love to go in the direction that you're talking about, Michael, but how do I collaborate? How do I get it out of Tinderbox into something that they'll actually accept? And you have the same dilemma, right? You wind up in Word whether you like it or not. And
yeah, I do, but only at the very last minute.
so you own a license for Word, then you have to buy Word whether you want it or not, because you have to.
You have to. Welcome to big tech. That's part of the crack that is big tech, right? You know, they force you to stay addicted in that way.
Right, and then they just change it and screw you over, and you can't do anything.
Right. Yeah, and honestly, that's why I'm getting And the other thing is, and I'm getting better at this in terms of the kind of friction that Chuck was bringing up. I've gotten a lot better in that I can get to 99% of what I need to do in my part of my own writing and my workspace. I own my own environment when I'm using Tinderbox and its ecosystem of tools. I only go to Word or PDF or an Excel at that last bit.
Right.
And then the collaboration that needs to be happening with another group of people, I actually look at somewhat of positive friction, in the sense that when they make changes in, say, the Google Docs document or the Word document that we're collaborating on together, I will then manually bring those changes back over that I want to into my Tinderbox environment. And that manual copy paste between the collaboration mode with others and those in the big tech software to my Tinderbox environment, it's a pain in the ass, but at the same time, that friction makes me think, do I really agree with the changes that the community is making in the document? Do I really want that stuff back in my Tinderbox file? And when I do, I bring it in. When I don't, fuck it, right?
So you have to go through a whole red line then do that.
Yeah, and I'm getting better automating some of that redlining, merging diff capabilities. And now that I've getting really much more, so Chuck's next layer effort is to be playing with action code and templating. My next layer is to go to the next level deep, because I figured all that out in Tinderbox. And now I'm going down into the S64 command line stuff of the Mac OS, and I'm gonna start playing with the, because Mac OS natively has a command line for diff comparisons between two documents.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
And so I'm in the research project where I could copy and paste the red line from the community, say out of a Google Doc, drop that into a Tinderbox note, then run a command line diff that it would actually give me the red line environment in Tinderbox. And then I can figure out what to do with it. So that's my next evolution. So what I've really learned and figured out over the last couple of months as I've been productizing my modules is that Tinderbox is truly an IDE environment.
Mm.
And effectively what I've done is I built a publishing system on top of the tool that is Tinderbox. And leveraging the underlying, especially when you have the run command, you basically can build this unique standalone publishing system on top of Tinderbox. And then that's why it then for me replaces Mello and Scrivener and all of these other apps, because I just don't need them. And it's and I had a guy the other day last week come to my house. It was actually really fun. It's the first time it's ever happened to me in the 4 years I've been doing the meetups. I joined this men's group a couple months ago, and my sponsor in the men's group had been talking to one of his friends, and somehow my name came up, and they're like, "Oh, that the guy that does all those videos," and he like lives 20 minutes from my house. I've never met somebody that's watched my videos, has never met me, lives 20 minutes away from me, and is a Tinderbox user too. So he came over to my house for like 2 hours last Friday, and he's really big into Tana, and so we were doing a Tana Tinderbox comparison, effort to get together for a couple of hours. And as cool as a Tana tool was, and we've seen a lot about it in the community around it, again, I come back to, it's great, but it's cloud-based only. It's got to Steve's point, it's got a bunch of hard walls that as soon as you bump into them, you're like, I'm done. Why bump my head into any other app's hard walls when I don't need to, because I've got the universality of Tinderbox. But very interesting. Chuck, you were going to say something?
I think you hit on an important point, but you and Fred, which is still the challenge with Tinderbox is how do we collaborate with other people?
That's the biggest problem.
That is the biggest problem. And to a certain extent, the reason Word is the beast it is and a monopoly is because of this requirement to be able to collaborate. So it became the lingua franca, if you will, of word processors, because corporate America sort of decided, everybody's going to use Word. And I say Word because that existed before the concept of a Microsoft Office existed. In fact, surprisingly, it was first done on the Mac, but who knows? The reason that I think this is so challenging is it's a question of compatibility of technologies. So Tinderbox runs immediately into the issue that it's Mac only. And Word is cross-platform partially. It certainly has quirks as you go cross-platform. Some of the other tools are also cross-platform. So that's an advantage for collaboration if people are going to be collaborating cross-platform. But then there are other issues that come to it, which is, how do you arrange for multiple people to work on a common document? Google Docs has their approach. It's mildly effective. You could certainly use the revision tracking that's in Word, although they've really kind of messed that up lately. And you can pass along comments from one partner to another, which is just what I was doing this week with my partners, and get edits into a document that somebody at the end merges. And maybe it's mildly easier, but it's not that different from what you were describing, Michael. and that you've got to take a look at each one of those revisions and decide, do you accept that or not? Because, you know, different people are going to have different points of view, and you may not agree with what their suggested change was. But then in other cases where somebody's made an addition of a new paragraph, which you like, you do want to bring that in. So it's still a somewhat manual process when you want to create the final document that is yours, and incorporates feedback and input from your colleagues. But it still is a challenge, and not that many systems give people the ability to do that degree of collaboration. And it would be very interesting to see if that's something that could be retrofitted to Tinderbox. Is there some way we could do that? Is there some intermediate product that you could put out there that would take the content from a Tinderbox document, make it available cross-platform, and allow people to make edit changes to it in the content, and then be able to bring that back into Tinderbox? I don't know whether that's feasible or not, but I think that's the kind of approach that might be needed to address this problem.
So, so if you can, in traditional product management parlance, how would you write the one or two feature requirements in the language of, as a user, I want XYZ, and maybe we could bring that back to Mark as an output of this conversation of like, and that could become maybe Tinderbox 11, like that actually has something, or we build that gateway app that you were talking about for the collaboration.
Right.
So what would the core feature requirements be for that collaboration?
Two major features that are needed. One is cross-platform something. It does not have to be full Tinderbox, but cross-platform ability for people to work on common content. And maybe there's some other tool out there that could be exploited for that is already cross-platform. So maybe an export to a tool that would support cross-platform work might be there. I cringe at the thought of making that a cloud service, but that's a possibility. So one could imagine, I do put that in air quotes, that you could output from Tinderbox to Google Docs, let people manipulate it, and then bring it back into Tinderbox later. But you know, those are just concepts. I mean, I think there's a lot of work to figure out exactly how to do that. The other side of that is you want that cross-platform editing tool to support revisioning. So multiple people can go in, make edits, add content, without all the elaborate automatic generation of things, without necessarily elaborate prototypes or action code or anything like that. All that is something that's in the Tinderbox realm. But being able to make textual edits, add a picture, move a paragraph, that kind of stuff, that would be desirable. And having that be an adjunct to Tinderbox, I think would be, you know, a useful direction to go in. I don't diminish the amount of work that's required. I think that's a significant effort. So, but it's probably worth doing.
Yeah. So I hear you say cross-platform. Frederick put in the chat kind of diff management.
Yes.
Is interesting. And one comment I want to respond to Frederick's point on the AI. Another reason why, so Frederick made a point in the chat, you know, ever since they added AI to Word, my version doesn't work anymore. My biggest concern with what's happening in the big tech environments, it's particularly, I don't understand what they're doing. Like, I don't like the idea that I'm writing in a Word-like environment with their AI essentially watching and interpreting every paragraph, every keystroke I'm making in that environment, and having this smart AI do something. Well, I don't want my thinking on your servers. I don't want your AI until I actually consciously choose to have the AI be my partner, looking over my shoulder. And I just don't want big tech in my, I don't want that level of big tech in my shit. And that's what really bothers me.
Well, you sort of implied that big tech has some vision of what they're trying to do. And
Well, I don't think they
that's
do.
that,
They're
that's
they're
the
putting
problem.
they're putting my word
There's
on
the
their
problem.
they're putting my work, my contribution, my copywritten material, my thinking on their servers
Mhm.
with as their AI is monitoring it, and because none of this is locally running yet. It's not locally running AI models right now, and I just have a real problem with that because I not only am I paying to license your software, I'm also training your AI now and I don't
Yeah.
have a choice. I don't
Yeah.
have a choice to say go F off. I'm not in. I don't want to be in the business of training your AI.
But how can we monetize you otherwise?
Right. Right. So
Well, you know,
that's
the scary concept is, you know, I'm really worried about the intelligence level in our country these days after the last couple of years. I'm sorry. If we train all of our AIs on the typical American lack of illiteracy, I'm sorry, that scares me.
Then you'll
well,
have
and
illiterate AI.
no disrespect to to any one individual, but in aggregate, the United States population has an 8th grade reading level.
Wow.
Yeah.
And and that's what scares me as well, in that we have people signing up for these terms of service and these privacy policies with the average reading level of an eighth grader.
Well,
And
wait a minute. Nobody reads policies anyway.
yeah, but even if they try, I mean, I try to read. I occasionally, I just for fun, I'll look at it. I'm like, I even don't know what the hell it's saying, right? Because of the asymmetries of power of their hundreds of lawyers
Mhm.
can write any word they want that would then lean towards their agency and what they want to get out of it, not what the individual wants out of it. So, I mean, we're kind of meandering this conversation around, but that really kind of circles me back to why I so love this tool. Is it's local, it's not it's the analysis is being done locally. I'm only sharing with others when I want to. I bring back stuff when I want to. um and honestly, the collaboration that you talk about, Chuck, I'm finding more and more I'm doing less collaboration until that very last step if I'm co-authoring an article with people. But who I'm really collaborating with is my future self. Like,
Mhm.
I'd love to have collaboration and diff management with myself, let alone anybody else. And that's I think that might be the first step in collaboration, is how do we collaborate with one's future self, possibly between Tinderbox files or other documents that we might have on our hard drive. Like, if we can figure that out, like, how do I collaborate with myself, publish to a Word document, make some edits in the Word document, bring those edits back, even if it's just with myself. And I'm not sure how to do that, but that would be interesting. Well, we can continue down this thread, or if we want, I can show you a couple projects I've been working on this week.
Can I
I've
make
been,
one
Dave
comment?
and Fred
Can I make
had
one
comments.
comment?
oh yeah, please.
I think there's a lot to be said for plain text. It survives changes in operating systems and platforms and over time. There's a whole bunch of people that advocate plain text, and I think Tinderbox comes remarkably close to that, and certainly lets you export plain text, and I don't think we want to lose that. And I think that has a lot of advantages. Yet we're trying to also have the ability to do WYSIWYG or whatever to make it easier. I'm not sure. The main thing I wanted to say is I'm not sure I agree with Chuck on the cross-platform. I understand that that brings in a broader community, but it seems like that would be a real heavy lift to start with, and maybe the Mac app could first do things that are needed before trying to go cross-platform. But that's just a thought.
Well, I would certainly say that finding reasonable common denominators is important. And the path could go in multiple directions, and I think we could talk about where we want to wind up. But I would say you're quite correct that we could certainly start with doing things within Tinderbox, within the Mac ecosystem first, and then go beyond that. By the way, it occurs to me there's a third element of what's needed if we're going to collaborate, and that is there needs to be some means of assuring integrity, non-repudiation, all the good security terms for content. And so, the ability to begin signing, if not an entire Tinderbox document, signing notes within a Tinderbox document might be really important, because then when you start collaborating, you can be assured that you're getting something that hasn't been manipulated or confused or run through an AI without you knowing it, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where my personal work comes into, and the whole idea of the provenance of content, self-sovereign identity, the ability to have agency and control of the copyright of the material to which I produce.
Yeah,
I think that's crucial as we weigh into this next generation of future thinking and driven by AI and agentic experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, Frederick, you were nodding your head, and then Dave, you had a comment, I think.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with Chuck. I think it's really important, and we can add encryption to the list too, probably. But I think these things should be on the list.
Yeah.
Okay. Dave, you had a comment?
Yeah, I guess it's a little unclear to me what the concept of collaboration is. To me, collaboration is a mutual meeting of the minds, between relative equals. But how is it a collaborative effort when one party demands that, your work appear in this particular format by this particular software? What that sounds like is a work for hire, which is a somewhat different uh, question. So, how are we using this term collaboration, yet we're compelled to do things that we'd rather not do? How is that collaborative?
Well, I can answer that. I mean, you got people collaborating on a paper or a document, and that's great, and they can collaborate however they want. And then at some
Well,
point,
but
wait. But then they go to a publisher, and the publisher demands that it be done a certain way, and they want to get it published. So you're not collaborating with the publisher per se, but you're working together to get to the publisher, if you understand what I'm saying.
Well, so again, a group of equals of some kind, presumably come to a mutual understanding of how they are going to, skin this cat. It may be plain text, maybe RTF, whatever, but it doesn't sound like that's an insurmountable problem or something that we should place on the developer to, help us with. I'm just trying to understand. We keep saying collaboration, but I don't understand, what the context is. When you're compelled to do something, that doesn't sound like collaboration. That sounds like work. That sounds like somebody has authority that you have to respect.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think you're missing what I said, though. Like you might get stuck with having to give a publisher a Word document.
At the end
That's
of the day, yeah, I mean but you're not going to be collaborating in the Word environment. You're going, at the end of the day, you're going to pour whatever process, the output of whatever process into a Word document through copy and paste or something, and you will present that to whoever the person is whose permission you must seek to have your document appear in whatever platform they control.
yeah.
But
To
but
date, the path of least resistance has been just to do it in Word with everyone, because everybody's got Word and they know how to use it, sort of,
Yeah.
and they do it badly and nothing works. Hey, that's the way it goes.
then,
Well, and that's kind of the sneaker net version of redlining Word files back and forth and emailing them back and forth, which is just a freaking nightmare. But then there's the other form of collaboration of let's pop up a Google Doc or a Google Slides, and we then collaborate in that we're co-writing in that same document and offering suggestions and edits. And then at some point, somebody raises their hand and says, okay, I'm going to take master control and accept and reject edits, and then finally get some final document. And I think that's what we mean by collaboration. Most people mean by collaboration is pop up a common slide deck, pop up a Word like document or a Google Docs like document, and start co-writing paragraphs together. But that in itself just becomes a hyper super messy thing too, because invariably people then go back to their own corners with their own version of that document, rewrite it, and then you're just having this constant collaboration. The other area where I see people doing similar type work is like in a GitHub type co-writing environment. But that too then has its overhead of needing to understand the syntax of GitHub and how to write those kinds of documents.
So maybe it's just hard to work together with people to produce a text. And I don't know the reason. What prompted my question is that you asked Chuck to describe a feature set that we would present to Mark to make Tinderbox more collaboration friendly. And that just seems, now we got to define collaboration, and we're all over the map on what that is. I don't think this is a problem that Eastgate Systems needs to solve. I think that collaborators need to work out their own issues. So,
well, I mean, I'll give you another example of collaboration where I struggle with it is just collaborating with my co-author on the next version of our textbook. Right? We're, I'm forcing her to work to write the textbook in Tinderbox because I just can't do it otherwise. But where we're ending up is, she's going to write in one Tinderbox file her chapters. I'm going to write in my Tinderbox file in my chapters. But then how do we collaborate? How do I provide editorial suggestions for her version of the document? How does she provide editorial suggestions for my version of the document? How do we then merge those into a collective book that we're writing? That right now, that's fraught for confusion. Because what if attribute names are different, or I've tweaked a little bit of code in my version that changes that doesn't get into her version of the document.
but now you're not collaborating on a document. When you talk about tweaking code, it's no longer a document per se. It's now kind of an application.
But that's the problem. The collaborator. So I'm writing a book with Mary Beth.
You say it's a textbook?
We are mobile marketing essentials. We're writing a 10 chapter, 300-page textbook that has entities, terminology, use cases, case studies, learning objectives. It's a full-on textbook, right? It has training materials.
People have done for centuries.
Right.
But I'm just saying that when you talk about, collaborating, now you're collaborating not just on the document, you're collaborating on the means that you use to produce the document, which again, you got to work that stuff out between each other. I don't know. I think
But here's the problem though. That's the point. This is where it gets really challenging. Like I'm super advanced in Tinderbox. She's not. And where we want to collaborate are what the words are on the page, but then how do we get those words on the page? How do we have all of the information that are about those words on the page make sense in the most efficient and effective way possible? And invariably, this is what happened in our last editorial round of the Tinderbox. She got frustrated with Tinderbox and started doing her work in Google Docs, which then created a tremendous amount of angst and frustration on my part, because then the glossary of terms got out of whack, the definitions got out of whack, the linkages got out of whack, and then there was a tremendous amount of manual rework that had to be happening of deconstructing all of that out of the Google Doc back into a more dynamic environment that is Tinderbox. And that's what we mean by collaboration. It's really hard.
Well, especially when you're making somebody use Tinderbox who is not Tinderbox, doesn't have an affinity for it. So again, I maybe you need a therapist, a couples therapy to kind of sort that issue out, because it seems to me that you ought to respect where she's coming from, where she's at, and accommodate yourself somehow to, if the value she's contributing, you want her thoughts, her ideas, then you should welcome them in whatever format she's prepared to present them to you. But that's just me. I just collaboration. God, I'm glad I'm retired. But where's David Eddy when you need him? All right, I'll shut up now.
No, and Dave, just to your point, I do, and I respect that. And for her, it meant she had to do her work in Google Docs. But what that ended up meaning for me was probably about 20 to 30 hours of work manual work that I would have appreciated not having to do because I knew how unnecessary that 30 hours was.
Could you have gotten her contribution? Could you have made it yourself?
If I made it myself, I would have written the book myself and not had a contributor.
Exactly. So,
Right?
that's
That's
my point. If you value a contributor and they offer you something of value, then you accept it in the way that they offer it. And yeah, sometimes it's more work. I'm sure every collaborative effort is more work than just doing it on your own, but presumably at the end of the day, you get a better product. Now I'll shut up.
no, don't shut up. But this is the nature of the problem. It's not what you're saying is perfectly great, but that's the nature of the problem. And the natural tendency and friction of pushing back is, okay, you haven't fully learned Tinderbox yet. Great. Do what you need to do, but let's also recognize and accept the fact that I'm now burning 20, 30 hours of time that in my world and view is completely unnecessary. Right? And it's frustrating. But yet, and the reason why I will accept it is because there's value coming back. But I think that's the natural tension between just the generalized human condition and the collaboration of this new digital human world effort. It's really hard. Chuck, you've been raising your hand for a while.
Well, let me let some of the other people speak, because Steve and Phil have hands raised.
Phil, Steve, go for it. Hi, Bruce.
Yeah,
Okay.
so where I was going to go is kind of where Dave was going.
Okay.
When you're collaborating, maybe you're tied into Tinderbox, but if you're collaborating with 4 other people and all they can use is Word, maybe you're the one that has to compromise. And in your mind, you're not compromising. All you're seeing is this extra work. You can obviate that extra work by just working in Word. You may not like it, but you'll obviate. That's what you have to do. You can use Tinderbox for other things. We seem to want to fit the entire world into Tinderbox in all these discussions. You can't. So you got to figure out how you fit into their world.
But then that's where the utilities that Chuck and I were proposing come into play. Is there a way to publish that material and to easily bring it back so that we can do what we were just talking about? But part of what I struggle with, and I firmly believe this, I believe Google Docs, I believe Microsoft Word, I believe PowerPoint retards one's thinking. And in fact, one of the findings of the Challenger space shuttle explosion was death by PowerPoint. One of the results that they came back with was one of the engineers, while was reporting back a risk in a PowerPoint presentation that said, if this could lead to a catastrophic failure and the blowing up of the space shuttle. And they were able to go back to an engineer who had presented a PowerPoint but the nature of the way that information was being conveyed got so diluted in the retardation of thinking in PowerPoint that it was completely missed. And
That's
so
not
really,
that's not a PowerPoint problem. That's a person communication problem, and not thinking about how I need to present my material so it's clear.
But
that has nothing to do. He could have done that in any platform. He could have done that in Tinderbox. That's a communication problem.
I'm going to suggest that we've been talking about collaboration, and if we want to move things forward, maybe we need to take a really small step. And my thought on the small step is that you could have, instead of having co-equal authors, have essentially a commenting feature so that others could add comments to the content that the main author has provided. And then that way you have the ideas, but you're not really giving control over either a section of the document or the whole document to someone else. They can use the tools that they're familiar with, just sort of text editing kinds of things. And my sense of it is that's probably a step in the right direction, and it might solve 80% of the collaboration needs. just being able to comment on what the primary author has put out there without the ability to edit directly that, just add a comment or two. And then the editor can consider that. And if somebody's offering alternative language, they could copy and paste that alternative language, the primary author, into the Tinderbox itself. It's sort of just an unequal view of collaboration.
I agree. And then a lot of that time, and then to add even further to the mix when it comes to things like this, what are the commercial terms that we're agreeing with in that collaboration? Because then you end up with the, okay, who gets what percentage of that sale, or who gets to actually own, what are the intellectual property rights of owning that content in that collaboration? That's where it gets also super messy. Anybody else thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I was just gonna I empathize with what Dave brought up, and Phil as well. Yeah, I think collaboration is a complex topic. It is something we need to give attention to because it's important. Individuals coming up with ideas and putting out an individual perspective is another set of constraints. It's another limitation. And so if we have people who want to create content and we can make it easier for them to work with others in the developing the concepts, putting the text together, finding the pictures that are right. There's a lot of things that go on in that collaboration process that go beyond what a single individual can do. And I think it's just unfortunate that our computing tools have not been better. And this is across the board, and Word is just as much of a problem as anything else out there. But we just haven't developed the right set of tools for people to work together with less friction. And the other point is that, yeah, there might be a primary author, but if the primary author is the one who always gets stuck with the tedious aspect of editing together everybody's inputs and then making it available to the publisher with their constraints, those are hugely difficult jobs, totally unappreciated. And people can just be saddled with an enormous amount of effort, which leads to the very problem you want, which is people just avoiding doing that work.
Right.
And avoiding the integration of multiple people's inputs into something which is a better product.
And part of that problem then too is the primary author also has their own thinking and contributory efforts that they want to make, but their creativity gets so drained because they're doing all of this manual tasking effort.
Or they become the little dictators who tell everybody else, this is how you have to do it.
So
Exactly.
Which defeats collaboration.
So
Right.
what you're describing then is, again, it's a dysfunctional relationship organization. What you want is a project manager or an editor. You want some disinterested party who is only concerned with process and product, and the collaborators, the authors, use whatever tool. So you're going to pay this guy. I mean, if you want to avoid the work.
Where's AI when we need it?
Exactly. Well, that's probably what's going to happen ultimately.
Right.
But it seems to me that either collaboration is worth it or it's too much trouble. And Chuck, what you were just describing is that for many people it's too much trouble. And
Yeah,
what's
unfortunately.
wrong with that? I mean, but I think these problems can be solved with a different type of organization where you have, and maybe it's probably not, AI is going to eat it before it became, but somebody who's like an integrator, a text software media integrator that takes there's an overall contract outline of what the final product is envisioned to be, and each party describes the tools that they are going to use to offer their contribution, and this expert in media conversion and presentation absorbs all that, and he's responsible for polishing the final product, putting it into whatever package or container the platform gatekeeper requires, to get this thing out into the world. So it's not, people hire assistants, they hire consultants. Again, this is what I think was Steve mentioned maybe adding in the comment feature to Tinderbox. That sounds reasonable. I don't know how difficult that would be. It's what scared me was Chuck was when you were mentioning the retraction or non-attribution or when you're starting to say all these notes have to be signed and cryptologically, a blockchain sort of thing to make sure
No,
you get
no.
credit for my contribution. That just scares the hell out of me. But so
Well, okay.
I think collaboration needs to be, if you're going to make a product and you're committed to collaboration, then you need to bring in all the people you need to bring in to make it effective. And that may mean a third party who's just there to facilitate and assemble and integrate the efforts.
That's what a tech writer used to be. We fired all of them.
Editors.
Corporate America has no use for tech writers anymore.
Editors.
But I can remember back in the 80s and somewhat into the 90s, that's what tech writers did in an organization. They talked to the engineers, they talked to the marketing people, they pulled it all together, they produced the final product. We don't hire those people anymore. We have totally disavowed the value that they created and tossed it over to India or Pakistan. And we get back crap, which is utterly useless for any product. It's been reduced to just a series of pictures that you're supposed to, IKEA-like diagrams to put things together that are incredibly complex and have enormous security implications if somebody gets it wrong. That's where we are. Sorry, I'm going to shut up. I've had it. I said too much today.
Right. Go ahead, Fred.
Two things. One is there's often the case that people don't have the money to hire lots of people. So if you're in a very lean situation, you might just be working with one or two other people and not be able to hire people. But the point I wanted to make is that maybe open source offers an analogy, and many open source projects, I guess, did have a leader like Linus with Linux, and I don't know, Emacs, I guess, was Richard Stallman. So I don't know. Is open source an analogy? Does open source work? Do you have open source that's collaborative, that is low overhead? I think so. So that might be an analogy. That's what I wanted to mention.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, but again, the challenge with that is open source has its own overhead, and then someone needs to manage it. Someone needs to, it fundamentally comes down to, I think what Dave was talking about is we all need to agree on a common set of tools and a common set of workflows and a common set of methodologies and try to stick with it. And that in itself can be just an enormous challenge. And in my experience, what you end up doing is, unfortunately, you fall to the lowest common denominator, and we're just constantly being stuck at the lowest common denominator. So in some regard, and I don't want to be rude when I say this, but it's the weakest link that then drives the thinking, that then drives the production. And just in my experience, that can just completely retard any of the great creative thinking and efforts. And we spend our energies and efforts screwing around with the workflow and the tools and the lowest common denominator processes, and having to reconfigure tables in Microsoft Word because our content has now been munged together with structure and appearance, that we waste hours. I can't imagine how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of human hours are wasted because that we are driven to, in today's modern collaboration tools, to work in the lowest common denominator. Dave, you're smiling. You're on mute.
Bruce has had his hand up for a while.
Oh, Bruce, please.
Hi. No one answered, but I see what I stepped into. So, this is just making me think about I mean, the difference between this digitally driven form of collaboration versus, I think back to my undergraduate and graduate school days when we were helping the professor write a book. And, we'd meet at his cabin up in the hills, and the fireplace would be going and there'd be a good dinner. And my point is that I think there's something said to be getting everyone comfortable socially, and then you do your collaboration, as opposed to, and I do it all the time, that you get on these meetings and there you all are all, like we are right now in our little digital boxes, and we're, only because I think in part because we all have pre-existing social skills, knowing what it's like to be in a room of people, we sort of mentally bring that into this arena. And newer generations don't have that experience in the same way. And so when I think about collaboration and what collaboration means, I mean, the description of all these digital tools, as much as I use them, I was late today because I last minute wrote a presentation for 11 o'clock this morning based on a Wall Street article I read. And I was thrilled that I could do that. I never could have done that if it wasn't digital. But at the same time, it just seems like it's sucking all the fun out of it. I don't know.
It is. It is. I mean, I go back to when I was in college, my freshman dorm. What do you call them? The person overseeing the dorm, Brother Mel, was
The RA,
the RA,
resident assistant.
Yeah, well, the guy responsible for the resident assistant was Brother Mel, and every once a month on Friday nights he'd bring us into his room. We crack, and it was back in the '80s, so we could do this. Crack open a case of wine, pick a great works book like Dante's Inferno. And the night we did Dante's Inferno, he actually made the 9 Planes of Hell chili dip. The deeper you went into the dip, the hotter it got. And we sat there and read Dante's Inferno till like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and then collectively wrote a paper together. And it was awesome. I mean, back 30 years ago, I still remember that as being one of the greatest nights of my life. It was so much fun. And we don't do that anymore. Yeah, it's hard to find that. Somebody, I talked over somebody, anybody. So Bruce, I appreciate your comment. I think that it's struggling. And I was actually just talking with my son about this too, especially with the current COVID generation who spent at his age, 19, 20 years old, the formative socialization years of his life by himself in his bedroom for a year and a half. That's really, really screwed this generation up.
If anyone gets the Wall Street Journal, so I was so thrilled to see a clinical psychologist, my own profession, write something where I'm so proud of the piece that she wrote. It has to do with what you would call kind of middle-aged children, or what used to be called latency age, ages around 6 to 12, and how much they're struggling and how much they're having what appear to be teenage emotions. And I've got, I run parent meetings today, tomorrow, and next week. And, I've got 55 families where half of them are 6 to 12-year-olds. And these kids really do not know how to sit with their emotions. They don't know how to understand why they're upset about things. And many of them are fairly chronically upset. Given I work with a special needs population, I think it goes beyond that. So anyway, so that's what I wrote a little presentation on, but it was so timely because, I think of, what is it, Microsoft Teams or something? I mean, their brilliant idea on collaboration is to turn us into 3D models or avatars. I don't use Teams a lot, but I think I've seen that. I mean, is that really the direction to go? That, it just seems that the idea of collaboration is so important, and it's so useful. But I think of what we do when we sit around here and chat as collaboration. And you all know what my programming skills are. What do you think brings me back week after week? Trust me, it's not learning about the programming part. I'd love to be able to write the code that Dave and Chuck and all of you were able to write. I could write 1/100th of it. But you are also effing smart. You are kind. We all look out for each other. That makes it a worthwhile hour and a half. And I get ideas from it. And I wind up doing things later in the day that often relate back to something that Michael, in his jet headed to the moon, talks about, but I'm there on the tail, able to catch just a little bit of it, and I make use of it. So there's something in that, in what we're doing, that it's not software based, but it certainly, you know, people keep showing up. There's a reason they show up. We all have better things to do, I'm sure. And so there's that piece of collaboration, in other words, that somehow seems to be missing from practically any piece of software I've ever looked at. I don't know, does that make
Yes,
any sense?
Yeah,
it
yes, it
does.
does. And in fact, although I said I wasn't going to say anything more, I just can't resist. Between what we were just discussing and what Fred brought up, I think are two very important, if not metaphors, examples or case studies we can think about. One, the human interaction, either in a conference, on the phone, or face to face, is very important. And nothing is more powerful and interesting and compelling than when humans who work together and appreciate and respect each other come together to focus on a problem. And I think that's what we're doing here. The reason I also wanted to tie it into what Fred brought up was Fred brought up open source and open source development. Well, that's something that could not exist without specialized tools. The whole GitHub, Git and software maintenance tools that are associated with that, and the ability to add stuff and have it go through what is basically an editor who proofs it and make sure that it's appropriate to add into whatever the open source product or library is. All of that is very important. And as we said earlier, it's the editors who get sapped with a lot of the work. And in the open source world, that's the maintainer. And the maintainers are bailing right and left these days in the open source world because it has become such an onerous job, in part because the social aspect is broken down. Why is the social aspect broken down? Because we have so many bad actors trying to inject malicious code into open source projects. That's put a huge pressure on the maintainers. Make one slip up and you're the guy who gets blamed for a massive cybersecurity breakout. So we have to think about, how do we tie these two worlds together? The tool set that we use to work together, but then the social environment that allows us to do it effectively and without risk. And you know, if I could make one other analogy, there's a huge effort going on in the software world in general to finally dump the languages that are not memory safe, because so many of the security problems have to do with memory safety issues in languages like C. And that's a huge issue with the Unix crowd. And one of the things we see going on is this big battle, which would not be unlike any other battles we've seen between technology approaches, between the people who are saying, we got to move Linux to Rust because it's memory safe, and the rest, and the crowd that says, but I know C. I got to stick with C because that's what I know, and I can't do my maintainer job if it isn't C. And that sounds so familiar with it. I can't do it if it isn't Word. So, you know, there's some really interesting human dynamics colliding with the technologies, colliding with the need to move the technology forward. And I think the only answer to it is groups like ours sitting down, talking about what might be needed, what would help, and pulling multiple perspectives together in a way that's constructive and maybe comes up with some ideas as to how to take small steps, bit at a time, moving in the direction that services the broader need.
Very cool. Can you can you define memory safe coding for us real quick?
Okay. Memory safe coding is just the whole process of having a language that does not allow you to leave sections of memory available for misuse. I think that's the simplest way I could put it. Fred could probably state it better.
I can give an example of memory overrun.
Yeah, go ahead, Fred.
If you in C, you can say advance to the next character and put something there. You can define an array, but you in C, go beyond the end of the array and start writing what you think is the array, but it's not the array anymore. And God only knows where you're writing the stuff, and you can exploit that to attack. And these languages don't allow that. They don't have that ability that C has, where you can just arbitrarily go, star C
Go
plus
anywhere.
equals anything and do anything you want, and with no concern for memory layout or anything.
Got it.
Esoteric, but it means that there's a constraint that's added into newer languages that don't let you do these errors, which, by the way, are, I don't know, Chuck, but it's like most errors that people make in C are probably of that nature of buffer overflows, or overwriting.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, I mean, it's Pareto's law. Probably 80% of the security problems out there are due to memory safe problems.
So
I think is what I'm reading. The reason I brought it up was in part because there's this wonderful manifesto that's just been put out by, a large community of software experts and even some government agencies that are all saying, okay, we've reached the limit. We've got to stop with this. This is really, a bad way to go forward. And it's almost like I wish would happen. Somebody would do the same thing with Word. We've got to stop using Word. Word is the problem. And I know that's trivial, and I'm trivializing a situation, but sometimes it just takes enough people in the community coming together and saying, "Yep, we really got to change the way we do things." And that's what's going on in the software development world, and that's having a huge impact on the open source world. And we see all the social dynamics clashing and colliding, but also cooperating and collaborating in areas. We see all of those dynamics being worked out. And you want it to get somewhere, and maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it's all analogous to what we see here.
Yep. So can you give us a link to your memory safe manifesto?
I'll have to look that up.
If you can look it up,
seen reporting on it.
Yeah, and then Dave, what do you mean by the question mark of "I can't do it if it isn't Tinderbox"? What do you mean by that?
Riffing on Chuck, but there's a hand up. I was just riffing on Chuck. I can't do it if it's not Word. So I mean,
yeah,
we all have our biases, but there's a hand.
Well, and the reason why I personally reacted to that statement is I've said multiple times in these meetups is I really can't. I said I can't do it if it's not Tinderbox anymore, and I don't. It's not that I can't; it's I don't want to, and I think there's a big difference between can't and don't want to. And what I mean by I don't want to is when I'm working in any other tool, all I can keep thinking in the back of my mind is how much time I'm wasting, how inefficient I'm being, how much of the reuse of my work is being thrown out the window. How I'm unable to, how I'm being, my thinking is being unnecessarily bound into some linear or tabular or bulleted box. And that brings me all the way back to what Steve Harf said at the beginning of the call, is that Tinderbox allows you to navigate these paths pretty much unbounded, and you only bound when you need to. It's like, so for me, Tinderbox is like this quantum thinking environment that I get to think in a multi-dimensional state, and I'm only bounded when I actually need to be. And that's how I kind of reflect on that. Somebody else was going to make a comment.
Yeah, I got probably several points to make, but I'll start with this. The key thing about your particular situation with Beth, even if she were as competent as you are, your tinderboxes, they're based on your brain, your thoughts, what your relationships within that stuff are. You're not going to be able to share in that stuff. You might at best be able to create a new tinderbox and swap it back and forth like we have called SneakerNet, like we've done with Word documents and other kind of documents over the years. Perhaps with Eastgate, we'll be able to do something that would be nice. Would be simply letting me here take this note or this group of notes, and let me just send that to Michael, and all the attributes and all the other stuff gets there, and you get it, and then you figure out what to do with it. But collaboration is hard work. It's there's the thought process, of course, but then there's the mechanics of making it all work, and that's just
and that's really that send it over to Michael comment. That's really, Chuck and I have picked up the standard of late on building installers, and we had a really good conversation with Mark Anderson last week or week before last on this idea. And I think that's carrying that. It makes me think of like a Civil War analogy where somebody gets shot and they go picked up the standard flag and stands in front of it. I mean, we need to push that installer idea further and making it easier. Not just so I can send it to you, Roger, but so I can have it for myself.
Well, that goes the point. Yeah, I want to collaborate with myself with respect to these two different Tinderbox documents I have. This Correct. Is a real pain in the ass. If you solve that problem, they would go to solving this other problem to some degree.
And in all honesty, and if we have about 14 minutes left, so I do want to demonstrate a couple of things because I can actually show you that exact problem I solved for myself this week. Is I've been teaching in Tinderbox now for a couple, developing my courses and writing my books in this one Tinderbox file called Teaching Mobile Marketing, and for like last 3.5 years. And in the last couple of weeks, I built these new modules, and I'm like, I wonder if this is going to work. So I grabbed a couple of my installers, installed my latest code into this 3-year-old Tinderbox file, and I got to tell you, it worked perfectly. I mean, when I went back and started refactoring some of my older notes, I would get stuck, things wouldn't work, and then I had to figure out, okay, well, what's going on? Well, what's going on is some of the attribute naming was a little bit different. Some of those notes had locally assigned templates. But once I started discovering kind of where those friction points were, it got to the point now where I can just swap a template out, reset the displayed attributes so that the proper attribute names are there, and it works. And I think that kind of collaboratory thinking, I think, will be really helpful as we can kind of move these dialogues forward. And
it would be kind of cool if we could
bring
things in. It would be kind of cool if we could bring things into a sandbox section of Tinderbox, if you like. In other words, I give you something and you could bring it in, attributes and everything and all, but it still remains isolated from your Tinderbox until you explicitly do something.
Yeah, that would be interesting too, because there is that risk of, and Chuck, I don't want to, there is that risk of unintentional destruction. You and I were talking about that a week or two too. Like, there's so much power in this. You have to really trust somebody before you drop one of these installers in, because it can not only wreak havoc in your Tinderbox file, it can wreak havoc on your computer.
Well, just think about, we exchange Tinderbox files here. Those things have action code in them. Some of that action code can reach out and touch the operating system in an unfettered way.
The run command is your tool.
Yes, it is. It's my entry point into Unix.
Right, and and again, that could be a very dangerous vector if you're not careful.
Yes, it is.
And that's why we need a little bit more security built into the way the documents are structured, unfortunately. And then we'll discover that there are a lot of benefits to that security, which help the individual, help the self as well. So,
well, and then again, Chuck, and I'm all one for owning copyright and all that, but also it's also that ability to protect yourself too. And that, let's say someone were to grab some of my code and then present it and represent it as mine. That come and screws somebody's computer up, and they come back to me and says, Becker, you totally screwed me. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not me. Well, right now there's no way to assert provenance to actually demonstrate that it wasn't me.
Actually, a good useful feature in Tinderbox would be a mode where we could say, disable the run command. And instead of running it, just log what's being passed run command to a console. And then I can make a decision whether it's safe to turn that back on or not. That would be useful.
Or flag me when run command tries to run, so I can actually look at the code and says, this is code's trying to trigger run command. Are you sure?
Yeah, well, exactly. And by the way, as somebody who's worked in the software industry for the last 42 years, this whole thing with the manifesto and so on and so forth, that's great stuff. We've been talking about it for 20 years or more, and it hasn't changed yet. And part of the problem is, you realize the internet, everything, the operating systems and so on and so forth, they're written in unsafe languages. And switching all that stuff over to Rust, for example, yeah, it's not just a language translation thing; it's a quality issue. We've had all this experience with Linux. It appears to work, it's believed to work. Our experience is that, but as soon as you change it to Rust or any other programming language for that matter, it's back to day one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to do the whole social security system, so don't, it's a trivial problem with AI, right?
Well, I realize.
Well,
Somebody's going to use AI to translate all that COBOL stuff into something else that's equally convoluted.
Well, and it just comes down to kind of the human condition too. I mean, when the internet was born, it was born with this idea that scientists who knew each other, who trusted each other, were going to be opening up their computers to each other with this intended social contract that you wouldn't screw me. Right. And so, and that's really, and so the security, so basically it was computer cohabitation without protection. And then we realized in that process that led to, that wasn't necessarily the greatest idea, right? Because viruses and other similar things would come down.
The thing back then in those days is that it effectively was a hermetically sealed environment. There was absolute control of who had access to that stuff, and there weren't, the vast numbers like there are now.
Well, and there's a great article floating around. I'll stick it in the notes when I find it, where the first password hack though was in that environment when there was one of the MIT guys realized that he could grab his friend's password and then leverage and get free mainframe use. Back in the day. So, and these problems haven't gone away for a long time. All right, so we got about 8 minutes left. This has been a really, really fun conversation, and I appreciate it. If you guys don't mind, as we kind of wrap things up, I would like to demonstrate a couple things that I was working on this week. I think you might find it interesting. You all okay with that? All right. So about 30, 40 minutes ago, Chuck brought up this idea of, as you're doing your work, to be able to create glossaries of terms and similar concepts. And one of the things that we, in the latest cohort, my cohort number 4 for Tinderbox masterclasses, we've been talking about this fact too, that, and a few weeks back we talked about this as well. There's this idea of 4 kinds of notes. You have your project notes that you're working on, you have your resource notes, and then the 4th category note. I don't do this. I use Obsidian or other tools. The 4th category note would be my scratch notes. Whatever. Right. So you basically have your half thoughts, your scratch notes. I personally use these in Drafts or Obsidian or some other set of tools. You have your project notes, the notes that you're working and writing on. You have your resource notes. Other people call these atomic notes. They call them zettles. They're the highly curated atomic standalone insights and notes. And then you have what I call backstage, which are your functional Tinderbox notes. And Chuck's got some really unique ideas in his work on how to represent these and keep them out of map view and such like that. But as we think about writing and doing our work, and again, Frederick, you said it in the chat, which is really a more elegant way of what I was trying to say, is in the end of the day, I get better ROI out of Tinderbox than I do any other tool. And part of the reason why I get better ROI out of Tinderbox is reusability of my thinking, reusability of my thoughts, reusability of my efforts. And part of that reusability is, and this is, again, one of these things I so love about Tinderbox is I can have both my writing environment, my work production environment, and my Zettelkasten environment in the same document. And if I start thinking about it in that way and separating those concepts, I can do that. So for instance, in this document, I have all of these terms that I'm working on and defining. But the reason why those terms are coming up, much like what Steve Harf was saying in the beginning of the call, is as I'm writing an article or as I'm producing an article, I'll say, wait a minute, and again, I'm randomly doing this in some context, but wait a minute, there's this concept called citation management. So I'm going to populate this attribute term with the idea of citation management, which I'll then be able to later, using Tinderbox tools, dynamically link dynamically create that atomic note called citation management, which I then can go later define and redefine. In this context, I haven't done it yet because this is a test file, but I could then define it, go back to, and then have my continue on with my work. So what Tinderbox allows me to do is think, write, create, start developing reusable assets that I'll be able to reuse down the road. Chuck, when you said earlier, maybe you can write a book in Tinderbox too, you can. As I've said multiple times, I'm writing books in Tinderbox, and here's a great example of the test file I have here. Here's an example of a book. Here's an example of an article. They're both existing in the same document. In this document, I've got words here, I've got information here. Well, I have them down here too. And so if you see here, this document, I've got the word privacy. If I go up and look at the term privacy, I can see that the term privacy is linked to the preface of one book, of the book, but the term privacy is also linked to the introduction in the article. So I've got two different projects that I'm working on that are both linking to this atomic note, this zettle that I've been refining, and then later would have like countless numbers of citations associated with it that lead to me how I've refined that definition of what I would term privacy. So in this context, what you're seeing here is this idea that you've got a full book, you've got articles, you've got social media posts, all kind of working together in the same Tinderbox file, all referencing a corpus of atomic reusable ideas and notes and work that I've been doing and defining. So that kind of sets the context for what this project is. And then you take a step back and you say, okay, well, in this particular piece of work, I want to be able to index I want to be able to look at an index of the terminology I've used in this particular book. And so what my code does then in this context is it says rule. Basically, what this says is your project ID is the top note. And what I want you to do is I want you to go through and go interrogate the word term, the attribute term, and all of the notes that are within that project, and then come back and give me only those notes that are within that are represented in this particular project. So if I render that, I get a table, and this says, okay, here are the notes that the terms that you've used in that particular project. That's all that action code is doing. Go look at the descendants of the project and pull all of the values out of the term. And using a template, I'm able to then render that in a table. But then I could take a step back and say, well, you know what? I also want to get the text associated with those terms because I actually want to deliver a glossary. So there you go. Now I've got the text that I've gotten from the notes. So now I can actually publish this as a glossary associated with this article. And then I want to take a step farther. Not only do I want to have the terms that I've used in the article or the book or the chapter or the section of that chapter and the texts that are rendered within those things. What I also want to do is I also want to have, and I check in here, is yes index cross references. Give me the cross references where those terms are being used in this particular article, not necessarily across the entire Tinderbox file. And then you can do some really kind of unique things. If there's more than one use of that term within the article, you can actually say, okay, I can see there's two uses of that term here in these different sections of the document, whereas in this one, the term design is only used in that one section with the note name design. So this allows you to build the template I've developed here. The module I have now is a methodology for indexing and cross-referencing and developing glossaries for your terms. Now, what was kind of fun with this is I was experimenting with it, as we were talking about before. Tinderbox gives you the affinity to not only do this intersection such that the word privacy is only being used in the introduction and preface of this particular effort, and that's how the indexing is working. Now, what you can, and so I'm only indexing for what's the way it's being used within this particular chapter versus across the entire Tinderbox file. But then I was thinking, because Tinderbox lets us autonomize the efforts and energy, well, maybe I want in certain instances to present this index or this formatting in a different way. So let's say I wanted to actually render this index though as a list, as a bulleted list instead. And so now with just one attribute value change, I can change that, and I can then, you know, determine whether or not I want the content to be shown or not within that, or just have the bulleted list of the terms used by for. Likewise, that same idea is maybe we want to have that index being returned as an alphabetical term, and then maybe you want to have both the indexing and the text included. So this is my new publishing module that will allow you to be able to index any project, create a glossary of whatever, doesn't have to be terms, and index any project. And then the other kind of fun thing with this is, you know, in this example, we were just indexing against one attribute called term. Well, what would happen if within your particular book you had multiple attributes that had values that you wanted to collapse into a common index, such as author and person? Well, you can do that too. And the way my code goes out is that it will actually interrogate both any number of attributes that you stick in that to be able to create your attributes. So now you can do multiple attributes, and then you can take it a step farther. And like if you're doing academic work, citation keys, which sections of the book have I actually used that citation, or that article, have I actually used that citation, and how many times have I used that citation? So this one kind of core corpus of code lets me implement all these different methodologies of, you know, glossary terms, indexes of company references, index of citation references, indexing of people, etc. And then leveraging the same methodology that you can do there. What that then allows you to do too is, let's say I have these images that I've used in the article. Well, this same methodology then can be used with slightly modified code to then go up and say, okay, this image shows up in the outline of the article in this way at that point in time. So now I can actually use that to dynamically configure the numbering. So you've got number 1, number 2, so that the figure numbering or the table numbering using the same indexing methodology now enables you to have dynamic numbering of your figures, tables, or other media that you may be referencing within your article. And that works for any kinds of content, videos, images, and such like that. So this is the latest and new module I've been playing with. Any thoughts, comments, reactions about something like that?
Well, I think that's impressive.
Yeah, and in the end, it's really not that much code. It's just building a couple libraries to make that happen. So that was pretty cool. And then the last thing I'll show you before we leave, I'm rewriting a course for National University, and going back to the concepts that we were talking about earlier. So I'm writing up my syllabus I'm going to have for the class, you know, the different different course communications we're going to have for the program. But then I go down here, and this is where Tinderbox can be super powerful in that, you know, in this context, you know, for this assignment, you know, I've got an introduction, your learning objectives and all of that. We render that, and I'm saying, okay, I want you to do all of this work, you know, in this particular assignment, and the assignment has, you know, is worth 40 points, et cetera, and so I've got all of the big detail for every one of the assignments that I want the students to do in the class. When I want to roll that up, I create an alias to bring that up into the kind of materials that I'll be putting into the learning management system, so that the learning management system content, I haven't finished that template. So the learning management system could kind of have the content that I'm going to copy and paste into the system. And all I need to do is copy the HTML to publish that into the export. But what's really interesting when you're doing something like this is you can say, here are all of the individual assignments and all of their great detail with all of their points and the types of assignments they are. Because of Tinderbox templating and the use of include, I can say, if the type of this document is grading, which it is here, I want you to include this with the grading template. And so what that does is when I go render that, what Tinderbox is doing is it's automatically bulleting the 14 individual assignments that I want them to do, the 6 discussion assignments that I want them to do, my policies on the quizzes. But rather than showing the detail of every individual assignment, it's producing a table that dynamically captures and sums up the point values for every individual assignment, and then dynamically gives me the percentage weights for their grading. And now all I need to do to be able to publish that into the learning management system, in this case it's Brightspace, is to copy that HTML and then paste it into the learning management system, and I'm done. And so then that allows me to have ownership and control over my own content on my servers, and yet still can publish into the school, not servers, into my hard drive, and then still publish into the school's learning management system. So it's a really interesting, similar model of kind of the collaborating with self between my local management of my information and the school's learning management system. So these are the 2 projects I've been playing with this week. And again, it's a testament to show how the value, and going back to Chuck, the point that you had raised earlier about the article you were writing, you're right. I could go ahead and, copy and paste that content, but in the context here, I'm using this one include, and what that include is doing is it's going here, grading, and all that individual template is doing is saying, hey, I want you to go and collect all of the values from the individual group assignments, and then I want you to output those. And this is interesting, if the and down here too, I can say, like, if the group assignment, if the group value is 0, then don't display the group project in the output template. And so this is a great example of how you can take all of that detail that's absolutely necessary and you ultimately need, but then with one single template, you can summarize it all up in a little table and drop it into your output. And again, I know of no other tool that lets you do that. And then Frederick, going back to your point earlier with that you said about the ROI of Tinderbox, when I talk about the ROI of Tinderbox for me too, part of the ROI when I'm learning Tinderbox, I'm not just like learning Tinderbox. I'm learning HTML, I'm learning CSS, I'm learning standard coding syntax that is universally applicable across the board. And that's part of my ROI when I spend time learning Tinderbox, is because the skills I'm learning are universally applicable and not just tied to one particular tool. And I think that's a really important insight that people need to have when they take a step back and start learning Tinderbox.
Be careful about universally. I mean, CSS, HTML remain fairly specialized languages for what seems to be a universal, ubiquitous experience, but most people don't need to know HTML or need to know CSS. So
this is where I teach my college students, in a world driven by AI and a world driven by data, some of these fundamentals are crucial. It's almost a modern literacy issue to be able to understand basic CSS and basic HTML, because Word is driven by CSS, whether or not you know or not. You feed CSS into a Word or Google document, and that's how you get your formatting. And by learning CSS and HTML and some of these fundamental standards of the way we present and format content, that's how I found to be able to decouple myself from the dependency of the big brother, big tech software. Because by learning CSS in Tinderbox, I can now copy and paste my material into a Google Doc, and it's instantly available and perfectly formatted.
Not to belabor this, but that is a privileged view of somebody who operates in the technical, in a rather high level within a technical community. For most people, the guy, my electrician who comes and rewires my power panel has no need to know CSS and HTML. So, just my caution to you there is not to use words like universal when describing things that are really relatively niche for the vast majority of humanity.
Okay. Okay. I hear you, but as AI and these other technologies and these other tools investigate our lives, I think more and more of us are gonna need to know these fundamental languages. And even like your electrician guy point, if he's got a business and has a website, somebody's gonna have to do that work. And if he can't pay for somebody to do it, then
Facebook does it. I mean, that's the reality we live in today. I mean, he's not maintaining a website. So, again, my quibble is with the word universal. These are important things to know for people who travel in these circles, but they are not universal experiences. I think, we tend to, I think, inflate our own sense of self-worth by the things that we know that we think everyone should know. And I caution you on that.
Well, again, Dave, I'm going to push back. They are universal. Every web page, every website's using this technology. Now, to your point, does the electrician, in the context of his electrician business, absolutely need to become an expert in that? Probably not. But to understand the fact that these are the universal languages of computing and the internet. And if you're going to be a knowledge worker or business professional in this knowledge worker space, and if you want to actually understand what that AI agent is doing in and around your life, there's a certain level of self-accountability that one needs to have if they want to be able to understand how the modern world is working.
Right. And the guy who's replacing your tire, changing your oil, or picking up the trash on the curb doesn't need to know all that stuff. So again, it's
until his job to change the tire or change the oil goes away, and he needs to retool himself to be able to contribute into modern society.
Again, no, he needs to know English. English grammar is a universal skill that everyone should know. Basic arithmetic is a universal skill that everyone should know. Basic logic and reasoning is a universal skill everyone should know. These technical things that we do are not universal, and we don't do a good enough job on the basics. So I'm just a little humility is perhaps helpful as we think about the things that we do. So it just
no, I hear Chuck. You seem to wanting to make a comment.
No, I think Dave is making some relevant points. I guess I would say I interpreted what Michael said as being universal within the context of people who are content creators. And if you're going to create content, just like the guy who's going to change your tire had better know how to use the tools in his toolbox.
Yep.
And for mechanics, knowing what those tools are and how to use them is a universal. For people who create content, maybe understanding the basics of CSS is a universal. I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but it's important. You need to at least know what it does. And
partly for that too is if you're a marketing
is important.
Right, and partly for that too is because if you're a marketing manager and you're going to work with an engineer, it would be helpful to kind of understand the context of your collaborator. Like, what is that engineer doing in? And when you're making requests or you're giving designs, at least you have context to which the environment you're working in, and that will help with collaboration. Taking us back to the fundamentals of the prior conversation.
Yeah, we've beaten this one to death today.
Yeah, it was fun. All right, everybody, and Dave, I hear you pointing loud and clear. I think I agree. You made some really good points. All right, everybody, thank you very much. Great time, and we will catch you later.